like Focus and other groups that do a lot of campus ministry. So, John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman lived in the 19th century. Literally lived in the 19th century. He was born in 1801, first year of the 19th century, and died in 1890. So his life spanned the 19th century. He lived in England. He was an Anglican for much of his life. This was about 300 years after Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. Of course, the Anglicans still consider themselves essentially a third branch of the Church, right? So there was the Eastern Church, the Roman Church, and the Anglicans. So they did not consider themselves to be Protestants. It was in 1778, soon before Newman was born, that the Parliament passed the Catholic Relief Act, which allowed, for the first time in that 300-year span, allowed Catholics to own property and to inherit property. Okay, so up till that point, Catholics were very much discriminated against. Obviously, closer to Henry VIII, they were heavily persecuted and even killed at times, executed. All of the church lands were taken, right, by the Anglican Church. And so Catholics, even though there were many Catholics in England, they were heavily persecuted and certainly discriminated against. 1789, the French Revolution started, and with the French Revolution, a lot of Catholics moved out of France, escaped France, and fled to England. So all of a sudden, England had this much larger influx of Catholics, even though they were not much appreciated in England as well. And in 1801, the year that Newman was born, was the year when the United Kingdom annexed Ireland, Northern Ireland. Okay, so you can see how all of this started to shift, and there was a greater openness to Catholics, partly just out of necessity, to maintain some kind of order within the society, because there was a much larger group of Catholics, but they certainly weren't well respected. In 1829, so 28 years into Newman's life, England passed the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829, which finally allowed Catholics to vote and hold public office. They still could not. They weren't allowed to succeed to the throne or anything like that. But so things were starting to open up during Newman's lifetime, just to give you a sense of what he was experiencing. When he was born, he lived in a family that wasn't extremely religious. At age 15, he had something of a conversion experience and became an evangelical Calvinist, and was very much enthralled with sort of the excitement of the evangelical movement at the time, but he very quickly grew disinterested with that because he felt a very strong need for doctrine. That's very important, because today you'll hear Newman often described as somehow this very pastoral person who wasn't very concerned about holding very firmly to doctrine, and it's quite the opposite. I mean, this was the purpose and the direction of his life. So he turned to the Anglican Church, and by 24 he attended Oxford University. He was ordained an Anglican priest. At 24, became tutor of Oriel College, which is a very well-respected academically respected college at Oxford University. And also became vicar of the university church, which is really the thing that I think got him to be very well known. Students would literally flock to attend his sermons at the university church, and he became very, very well known for his sermons, and then started to fall into what was then known as the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was basically a push within the Anglican Church to, for lack of a better term, to sort of re-Catholicize the church. Now that can mean some things that it didn't mean. It didn't mean respect for the Pope. At this time, he actually wrote that he thought that the Pope was the Antichrist. But what it did mean was restoring respect for sound doctrine and firm liturgical practices, and sort of a tightening up of what was becoming very loose already in those days, and this move toward where the Anglican Church was becoming more and more Protestant instead of what was originally envisioned as just another branch of the Catholic Church. And so he became very influential in that, and it was because of his study of church history. He, in particular, he was studying the Arian heresy, and he studied a number of heresies going back, and he realized that through that study, basically came to the realization that no, the Anglican Church, in fact, was Protestantism of one form, and that it had actually broken away from the one true church. And so it wasn't long after that, it was in 1845, so he's already 44 years old, when he converted fully, or was received into the Roman Catholic Church. Almost immediately, he was encouraged to become a Catholic priest, so he was sent to Rome to study. Why was he sent to Rome? Because at that time, I don't believe there had been any seminaries established yet in England. Within the next 20 years, there were a few that were established, but the church was just getting off the ground, so it was missionary territory. One of the places we visited when we were in Rome was the Venerable English College, and I didn't really know the whole history there. It's known as the College of Martyrs because there are so many students seminarians who went there, studied for the priesthood, went to England, and were executed. Hundreds. And so they have all their names on the wall, and it's pretty impressive. So there's this sort of this springtime happening with the church, but it's not this glorious springtime. It's kind of an early springtime, right? It's a thaw. But for him, what he experienced was quite the opposite in his own life. I mean, he was one of the most celebrated Anglicans in England. I mean, he was very well known and very well respected. He had those who disagreed with him, and he gave all of that up and became a Catholic. He even had siblings who stopped talking to him for the rest of his life when he was entered into the Catholic Church, and a number of very good friends who would have nothing to do with him. So he lost a lot. He certainly lost his career as an educator at Oxford, and so he had to find another path. When he was in Rome, he had already been encouraged to look at the oratory movement. Are you familiar with the oratories? It's a very odd thing. Oratories are basically secular priests. The technical term, they're not secular and secularism, but secular priests are basically like diocesan priests, right? Those that serve parishes, those that serve the people in that way, not in a religious order, right? So it's not a religious order, and yet they live in these small communities, and they live in prayer and community, and go out and preach and have a certain charism and such. And so it's a very interesting beast that was originally started by St. Philip Neri. St. Philip Neri was a layman in Rome who would go around preaching and preaching and preaching, and this is right during toward the end of the Protestant Revolution, my wife calls it. And it was at a time where the church did not allow lay people or anyone who wasn't officially sanctioned by the bishop to preach anywhere, because they were very, very careful and concerned about people spreading falsehood, right? So here he was going all around Rome preaching and on fire for the faith. Everyone knew that he was a good man and that he was preaching the truth. And so Rome actually basically told him, you must enter the seminary, you must become a priest. So he did, and he was allowed, though, to live in this oratory, to found this oratory system. And Newman basically resurrected that whole thing, bringing it to England, and really gave it a lot of prominence. So while he was in Rome studying for the priesthood is when he really settled on, this is what I need to do. The Pope gave him permission, ordained him as an oratorian within the Congregation of Oratories, and he went back to Rome to establish the oratory. So that's basically his life. He, as a Catholic priest, he went on to write a number of very important theological works. He never considered himself a theologian. He outright said, "I am not a theologian," even though he was considered one of the greatest theologians in the church. And what he meant was he was not an academic theologian. He never sat down in order to study and write theology. Everything that he did was in response to a challenge to his own life, people who didn't trust his conversion, people who who had issues with something that maybe he said in passing or that he wrote, and then he would go on to defend it. And so these were more polemical works in his view, but great works of theology, great advancement in theology. He founded the oratory school. So this was a great achievement that doesn't get a lot of attention, but at the time there were these great private boarding schools in England, mostly for the wealthy, that were very prominent. And he established the oratory school in Birmingham, which actually grew to have quite a great reputation and was able to educate sort of the upper crust of the Catholics at that time, which was extremely important in order to get Catholics into the upper levels of society and everything. So he wrote Idea of a University, which again was a collection of lectures on the university. His Apologia Pro Vita Sua, usually just called his Apologia, was basically a defense of his conversion. I told you about how terribly he was treated by the Anglicans when he became Catholic. Well, he was almost as badly treated by the Catholics when he became Catholic. A lot of Catholics did not trust him. And this was at a time where they really couldn't understand why someone of such prominence would become Catholic, right? So it was there was a lot of distrust, and he was seen as a very much a liberal at the time, and so he was constantly having to defend himself, and so he wrote the Apologia to explain his conversion, and it's a great work of not just a great spiritual work documenting his conversion, but it's also a great work of theology, and a lot of converts point to the Apologia as something that helped move them into the Catholic Church. He wrote the essay on the development of doctrine. Interestingly, it was the first major work that he wrote after he became a Catholic. So he wrote it very early on. This is something that you may have seen cited in different places. Right now, it's a hot topic. The question about can doctrine develop? Can doctrine change? How does it move forward? What does that mean? He wrote a very important piece, and again, this shows you that even as an Anglican, his commitment to doctrine was very, very strong. And then another of his major works is called Grammar of Assent, which is just a fascinating and almost impossible to read book, but it's worth getting through, especially if you have a good teacher to walk you through it, because the theology there is just outstanding. And this is where we get a lot of his great theology about conscience. Okay, Newman is often referred to as the father of Vatican II. Obviously, he wasn't there, but his thought led to a lot of the underpinnings of the ideas of religious freedom and conscience and the role of the laity. All of this was very, very important to Newman. He also, interestingly, a lot of people aren't aware of his work just in literature. I mean, he wrote a lot of poetry that's considered well regarded as very good poetry. Lead Kindly Light, you may have heard. It's been made into hymns and such. Outstanding. Loss and Gain was a novel that he wrote, sort of semi-autobiographical. It's about a young man at a place that kind of looks like Oxford, who's kind of thinking of becoming Catholic, and right. So it's just it's a great thing. He had a great wit too. I mean, when you read it's very dry, but there's a lot of humor in all of his writing, so it's very interesting. So I've been making the argument surrounding Newman's canonization that he is a perfect saint for our time. And I've been trying to capture. I mean, Newman, just giving you that whole history, Newman was so many different things, right? He was an educator, he was a student, he was a theologian, he was a preacher, pastor, did a lot of just direct pastoral work with serving the poor and the people in Birmingham. He was a priest, he was a cardinal at the end of his life. I didn't mention that. He became a cardinal it was very last years of his life, and it was basically an honorary thing. So I don't know if you remember when Cardinal Dulles at Fordham, the Jesuit, was named a cardinal well after he could actually vote in any conclave. And it was a recognition. But for Newman, it was extremely important. I mean, this man who all his life was questioned and doubted by everyone on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the Tiber, I should say, was, here finally the Pope was making him a cardinal and saying, you're home. This is where you belong. So it was wonderful. So there's all of these things. So how do you wrap your head around it? And the term that I've been using is integrity. I really think this is a saint of integrity. And I think if you can think of one word that captures what we so desperately need today, right, in our society, in our politics, in our young people, in our education, in the church, we need integrity, right? We need a restoration of reminding ourselves of the essence of what we're all about and why we're here, right? And so, and I'm not just talking about his integrity as a person, because that's one thing that I think he's a shining example for all of us in his personal integrity. But then it's also in his understanding of the integrity of education, his understanding of the integrity of the human person, and his understanding of integrity within the church. So if let me see, I got a little bit of time here. Let me just quickly go through those points. As a person, Newman was very interesting. He was very much a pastor. He was known as just being extremely loving. People just loved to be with him personally. His Episcopal motto was cor ad cor loquitur, which means heart speaks to heart. It was very much about the personal influence that someone could have. And when he was in education, both university education and secondary education, he always talked about the importance of personal influence, that was how you reach people with the truth. He, as I said, students would flock to hear his sermons. People, he was the testimonies of the students who attended his oratory school was that the students just thought of him as just this loving father. One of them, who happened to be Hilaire Belloc, if any of you have ever read any of his work, he was one of his students. And while he was at the school, he was known for actually meeting personally with the parents of the students. So this was a boarding school. The parents would come, I don't know how many times a year to come and pick up their kids and bring them home for a holiday or for a little while. And he would deliberately schedule time with them to sit down with them and talk to them about the formation of their son. This was all men in the school. And to try to help the parents to understand where their son was and to help them guide the son. And this was something that may seem not very, no kidding, not a big deal. But in those days, that simply was not done. It was not a habit at boarding schools to do that. The idea was kind of, parents, you leave it to us. We're going to handle this. And so it was just part of who he was. So at the same time, he's very much this personable, pastoral, just one-on-one type of person. Meanwhile, he's this huge public figure all of his life. He was always a public intellectual. He was always out there arguing and battling in a kind way, but always what he said his life's purpose was fighting liberalism in religion. And by that he meant this idea that religion was somehow a private matter and that it was not a public thing, right? So this is exactly what we're dealing with today, this idea that religion's fine as long as you don't bring it out into the public square. If you want to be weird at home, that's fine, right? But don't bring it, don't let it influence us or get in our way. And he was very much opposed to that and opposed to relativism and all of this. And so he was constantly fighting at this in a very public way. And you don't usually find people who are both, right? Who are both the real a lot of times our public figures are not the nicest people individually, right? They're able to kind of compartmentalize and do the public thing and be a big, right? But they're not always the best one-on-one. He was very much both. And always fighting for Catholic doctrine. And so I think that has it's a great example and of great importance today, because there are certain arguments being put forward, or at least maybe being interpreted in this way, that somehow the pastoral approach, the care for the individual, the helping the individual person, and the one-on-one love somehow is in conflict with the steadfast, hold my feet firmly to Catholic doctrine. And Newman was very much both. You couldn't separate the two, one from the other. And how he managed to do that, like how he managed to be so, you could almost say rigid in his doctrinal defense, and yet also so pastoral and so well liked. I don't know. I haven't achieved it. So I don't know if you have. Secondly, in terms of integrity of education, so he was always an educator. His vocation certainly was to the priesthood, but I argue that he had a sort of a second vocation, and that was to education. Everything that he did in his life surrounded education. His conversion was through education. Even his public writings and his battles and everything was always sort of with this educational thrust to it. He always just wanted to help people to understand. He was asked by the Irish bishops to establish the Catholic University in Dublin. And in the end, the bishops are the ones who sent him away after 4 years, because they didn't actually agree with his vision. And so, but his vision since then has taken off and has been so well respected with his idea of a university. And the way he did this, when he talked about education, he said, education in its essence is about development of the mind. It's about intellectual development. It's about the formation of the mind, cultivation of the mind, developing what he called a philosophical habit or a philosophical mind, where you were able to organize thoughts and to separate falsehood from truth, and to establish hierarchies of ideas and knowledge, and to be able to understand the difference between one discipline and another, and where one ends and another begins. And he wanted lay people to have all of this. He certainly did. He had it in spades. But he wanted very much for lay people to have this. And he saw that as the essence of education. But then he also made the argument, as I said, in Idea of a University, that the fullest university, even though in its essence, you could have a university or an educational institution that's secular, that aims for cultivation of the mind. But the fullest version of that would be Catholic. And why is that? Why would that be necessary? Because he said, even though the essence of education is development, cultivation of the mind, you can't do that nearly as well if it's not Catholic. And there are two reasons for that. One, the spiritual formation and the personal social formation of young people was essential actually to being a good student, to being able to develop a philosophical mind, to develop that habit of thinking. You had to be someone who understood some level of discipline, who understood when to go to bed at night rather than going out drinking, or who understood, who was free of all the burdens of sin and the guilt and all the things that I think young people today are just racked with. They're just dealing with all of these social problems and girlfriends and who am I sleeping with and what's going to happen, are they going to get pregnant, and there are all these things that they have to deal with because of the laxity of the behavior that's actually somewhat encouraged by the college life today. And so, he actually argued that spiritual formation is essential to being a good intellectual, okay? In addition to that, he also argued that that education, particularly university, but in education generally, that education that restricts education so that you're not allowed to talk about a whole branch of knowledge, whether it's history, science, math, whatever it is, or theology, then it's not a full education. You can't understand the breadth of things. You can't understand the nature of things. You can't understand creation. You can't understand the human experience fully if you don't allow for the truths of theology. So whereas today a lot of people look at Catholic institutions as, yeah, well, that's education, but it's narrowly constricted within this Catholic thing. And he would say, no. It's not narrowly constricted. It's just that you're adding the truths of our faith, and the truths of our faith tell us certain things about how we should behave and how we should handle things. And all of that ought to be integrated. And if you don't do that, then you're missing something. If you try to do science without an ethical dimension, if you try to study math without an understanding of the order of the world and creation, if you try to study history without an understanding of the human person, then you're missing something very important to your study. It's another field, but it's another field that plays upon the field that you're studying. And so he felt that it was very necessary for an institution to be Catholic and to admit of the truths coming to us through the Catholic Church in order to really have a full and proper education. Otherwise, it's limited. It's missing very important key things. As far as integrity of the person, he had there's a great sermon that I just love that he delivered where he talks about young people, it talks about students, and he talks about them coming to him. And these are probably, at that point, he's talking about like high school age young people coming. And he says they come to school with all of these passions warring in their breast. And does that not describe the typical teenager, right? Even the very laid back one, they have all this stuff going on inside. They're getting pulled in all these directions. So they have these physical urges, they have moral or immoral urges, right? They have the conscience tugging them and pulling them in different directions, and they have temptation pulling them in different directions, and then they have their intellect, their mind wants to pull them in all different directions, and it all seems to be conflicted. None of it seems to work together. It all seems to be opposite to each other. And he said his argument was that that's the result of original sin, and that before original sin, when man was created, all of this worked in synthesis together. The intellect and the conscience in particular, and even our physical nature, all of it worked in concert toward the exact same end. And there was no conflict whatsoever. Your bodily urges weren't in conflict with your intellectual, what you knew was right morally or what you knew was right intellectually. None of it was conflicted. And so he describes education ultimately as reuniting what man has put us under, bringing that all back together. And I think it's just such a beautiful vision of education, especially for anyone who actually teaches or does that, to just know this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to put that kid back together, and some of them are really falling apart, right? So it's integrating what's been disintegrated. And unfortunately, I think education today, a lot of it is actually further disintegrating young people, right? So you can have a very good, intellectually strong education. You can go someplace where you're really, you're going, the Harvards of the world, right? You're going and you're getting these great, amazing minds, and they're teaching all this brilliant stuff. But if it's not in concert with where your conscience should be, and if it's not working together with an understanding of human nature and human destiny and what we're here for, it ends up actually disintegrating you. So it's not that pursuing a good, strong intellectual development is wrong, but if it's not done in concert, you end up getting pulled. So we start pulling people, to where, and you've probably met people like that, right? Who are just they're just brilliant, but their mind has been pulled so far away from where they should be. You wonder how that could be possible when they're so smart, right? And it's because it's not in concert with everything else. And then finally, in terms of integrity of the church, okay, so he lived at a time when secularism was really becoming very strong. He talked about, he spoke at the opening of a seminary, I think it was like 1870 or something, okay? And I think it was the first seminary to open since Henry VIII in the Birmingham diocese. I don't know if it was Diocese of Birmingham or what it was called at the time. And he stood there in front of these seminarians who were, ready to embark and become priests. And it was just this great springtime of the church, right? Things are finally opening wide open. And he talks about the age of infidelity. That we are warning them that we are now going into a time that the church has never seen before, a challenge that we've never seen before. Because all throughout history, throughout all the persecutions, everything, we were faced with other beliefs. We were faced by people who believe this about God or believe that about God, the heresies, the paganism. This was always our challenge, right? But now we're entering an age of infidelity. We're entering an age of irreligion, when people simply reject religion altogether. He said that's something that the church has not faced before. And so it's just I can just imagine the seminarian sitting there hearing this, like, boy, what a downer. But, he was trying to rally them. He was saying, look, you are here because you are being formed as soldiers. Don't think you're here because everything's suddenly getting easier. It's not. And so he very much saw what's coming, and I think today we've certainly seen it. Now it's really come fully in terms of the secularization of society. And so this, going back again to his understanding of the nature of conscience, the ability to be both heart speaks to heart, but also to be speaking firm truth, never to deviate from that. And he was so firmly disciplined that he would not let one or the other lead him astray. He would not let his pastoral love for someone lead him away from the truth of the faith. And he would not let his doctrinal defense ever lead him into being impolite. I mean, could kill you with the nicest words. He was so good at that, and I think in that sense he was very important to us. So finally, Newman had, the way Newman was able to do all of this, what was the key to all of this? I think it was very much his sense of providence. He had from the day from when he was very young, he had a very strong sense that God was just leading him step by step. And this runs through, you'll see this over and over and over again in his sermons from when he was an Anglican, going up all through his Catholic life. Lead Kindly Light, the poem that he wrote when he was really suffering and calling on God to help him. He says, "Lead kindly light amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home, lead thou me on." And he says, before I used to love and choose and see my own path, but now lead thou me on. Pride ruled my will, remember not my past years. So he's talking about how, God, I trust you. I trust in you, right? So the message of St. Faustina. And then there's another meditation that I'd like to end with that this just means a lot to me personally, because when my kids were growing up and I had my little kids in the room, this was we kind of turned it into a prayer. And so it was a prayer that I used to say with my kids, and so it just has a special meaning to me. But this is just part of it. He says, God has created me to do him some definite service. He's committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. Somehow I am necessary for his purposes, as necessary in my place as an archangel is in his. If indeed I fail, he can raise another, as he could make the stones children of Abraham. Yet I have a part in this great work. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. I shall do good. I shall do his work. I shall be an angel of peace, a preacher of truth in my own place, while not intending it, if I do but keep his commandments and serve him in my calling. So he just had a very strong sense of God will lead him. God will tell him what to do. He may not even understand what it's all about at the time, but he'll just keep moving forward step by step and do what God calls him to do. And I think that is probably the key to his sainthood and to his life. So, thank you. We do questions? I don't know how much. Probably went over a little bit here, yeah.
About 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
I'm a graduate of Catholic Women's College in the Midwest. My sense is that a lot of Catholic higher education today is not what it was when I was there.
Nope.
I think that's a well-known thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying to sort out what can be done. It seems like they're more reflective of the world around them than trying to be light to the world around them.
Right.
Now, I'm only talking about an N of one, so, but I think that this is true of others too. Is there a recognition of this generally? Is there a path for the church to, and I don't mean with a heavy hand, but to bring them more back into the traditional Catholic education?
Yeah, so with elementary and secondary education, there's just been great progress on that. With colleges, it's much more difficult. As in 1968, wait, I'm getting this wrong, 67, the Land O'Lakes statement, where the Catholic college leaders got together and basically said, in order to be fully a university, fully a college, we need to be independent of the church. And so they literally, within the next 5 to 10 years after that, nearly every college in the United States separated itself legally from the church, from their religious orders. So a Jesuit college today, I don't know if there are any that are, but most of them are completely legally independent of the Jesuits. So they'll have the Jesuit corporation, and then they'll have a separate board of trustees. They may have requirements that you have certain numbers of Jesuits. This is the same with the Dominican institutions, Franciscan. Most of the institutions are not owned by the orders. There are still some that are. So there was this legal separation, and part of it was because they thought that they wouldn't be able to get federal aid if they didn't do that, so it was for the money. It was also just kind of a sign of the times, right? Everything was kind of changing and the religious were leaving, and so there was all this going on. But there's a great book written by a man, Father James Burchell, who was a provost at Notre Dame, who apparently had his own problems while he was there and was accused of a number of things. But it's a great book looking at a history of religious colleges in the United States. And with the Catholic colleges, when he looks at the Catholic institutions, what he finds is that Catholic institutions up until getting into the 1940s, 50s, 60s, it started moving. But up until then, they were inhabited entirely by Catholics, Catholic students, Catholic administrators, Catholic faculty. Everyone there was Catholic. Everyone who was Catholic understood what Catholic meant. They all had a shared idea of what Catholic meant, even on the smallest behaviors and what they had a very clear idea of what education was supposed to be and what you're supposed to study at a Catholic school. And so there was just this shared idea. None of it was in writing. There were no formal policies enforcing this. It was just understood that we were Catholic. And so what happened is, with all of the shakeup in the church and then the GI Bill bringing in all these students into the schools that weren't Catholic, and then this effort to make the schools more prominent, and so they were going out there and hiring a lot of non-Catholics who had great credentials, were going to teach at the place. So as these things started moving more and more away from that entirely shared Catholic model, there was nothing really firmly in place that said you must do things this way. So they really drifted very fast. And so what is happening today is, at least among certain institutions, there's a development, and this is what the Cardinal Newman Society, a lot of the work that we're doing with colleges that will work with us, on really just laying down, making it very clear, this is who we are, this is our mission, this is why we do this is why we need to do this way, and almost re-engineering all of it. And some of it is very new, and it's exciting, but it's happening mostly at small institutions. Most of them are ones that were established since the 1970s. So we're having a lot of difficulty getting through to any institution that was around before that shift in the 60s and 70s that made the shift. There are very few that have turned around. There's Franciscan University of Steubenville, you may have heard of. A lot of people don't realize that place was a party school about ready to shut down when Father Scanlon came in. It was not a very Catholic school, and he turned the place completely around. Catholic University of America is having more of a slower renaissance, but it's really moved in a great direction. University of Dallas kind of was a little weaker for a little while, and is a very strong Catholic institution today. University of Mary is one that we just added to our Newman Guide out in North Dakota, and they just got this dynamic president who's just kind of a Father Scanlon type who's just turned the place around. So we are seeing this start to happen, and we do have a number of colleges that are coming to us asking us to put them in the Newman Guide. So that's hopeful.
Just one follow-up. There's no requirement for a Catholic college to have philosophy and theology as a requirement?
For us, there is. Sure. Yeah.
What I'm saying is...
There are really no clear... The Ex Corde Ecclesiae, John Paul II issued Ex Corde Ecclesiae in 1990, and that's the Church's constitution for Catholic universities, and it does call for that. But there's a lot of room for error.
I was taken by your comments about the development of sort of this Catholic education being important in terms of development of the intellectual mind.
Uh-huh.
And specifically, I recall, of all things, reading in the Post after Justice Roberts was sort of appointed to the bench, the number of Catholics that are on the bench, and that Catholic education that they had was important in that process.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I can't help but think, I guess, I would appreciate your comments in terms of when we look at universities, one of the things that I think is a problem is the fact that kids go to college in quote-unquote liberal arts education, and instead of it being sort of a classic education where they're getting, as you said, sort of philosophy, theology, English, history, science, everybody sort of picks their own little course, which often leads them, to be an expert in one thing, and really not really getting the whole value of an education.
Yeah.
Is that beginning to change? Because that's so important.
Not really. It hasn't, unfortunately. So now the big push is, for all those who don't like that, now the big push is to turn away from liberal arts altogether, right? So Newman is often used as, we're doing things the Newman way. We've got all these liberal arts courses. So he's very much distorted in that as a defense of this idea of the liberal arts. Newman actually makes the argument in Idea of a University that in principle he doesn't care what you're studying. He doesn't care if you're studying botany or feminist studies. It's not the topic that you're studying. It's the development of the habits of the mind and the philosophical mind. And you could do that within any discipline. You can develop, but you do need to have a basic understanding of philosophy and theology as the foundations for that. So that's why philosophy and theology do really, even though he says that, they factor very importantly. But he doesn't really have a problem with someone having a good education up through high school, go to college, and just be a business major and study nothing but business. But do it in the right way, that it develops your mind and you become a businessman who can think and solve problems and evaluate things. You can't possibly know all knowledge. And so what we're doing today is, I think what's happened is knowledge has expanded so dramatically since Newman's time. I mean, incredibly, right? The amount of facts. And I look at my kids and they're studying biology for high school, and they got this huge textbook, and they're learning about every little tiny thing in germ and germs. That I've already dated myself talking about germs. All this, and I'm just like, is it really necessary for you to have all that knowledge, or is it really more important that you understand how biology works and the basic functions. And we're trying to cram so much information into kids' heads that we've pushed all the effort to teaching them how to think and how to sit and discuss and dialogue and present and communicate, right? We talk about man is made in the image of God. I read something just a while ago that just really opened my eyes. You know, they're talking about, when we talk about the image of God, we talk about usually about reason, our ability to think and reason. And they said communication is the other side of that. That communication is the act of love by which we take what's in our head, the reasoning that we've been able to do, and we communicate it to each other. If we couldn't do that, reason would be not worth very much, right? And so learning how to communicate is so important to all of it too. So. Okay, let's save my voice.
You'll be pleased to learn that I'm a member of the
Thank you very much.
Society.
Yes.
My wife and I don't have children. We have 22 nieces and nephews.
Wow.
And a number of
You're busy enough.
grandnieces and grandnephews.
Uh-huh.
My godson just went through his confirmation, so I'm encouraging everybody to gravitate to that table before they pick up some of the literature on the Newman Society. You're a wonderful organization. The question I have for you, though, is personal. How was it that you specifically came to gravitate towards Newman? How did that occur? When did
Oh, towards Newman? It was really just, you know, when we started this, I was 2 years out of college when I started the Newman Society. Okay, so we went, that was 1993 when we started, and I didn't go full time until 2002. So there was a long gestation here. We started as young people and kind of developed it from there. But